Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn more on how to support this channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. Today I will be continuing to look at the list of things Jim Palmer, a former megachurch pastor, says the religious establishment does not want you to know. We're looking at what it is that they don't want you to know, why they don't want you to know it, and what aspects this has dealing with deconversion. So today is number 8, where Palmer says, theology isn't the free search for truth, but rather a defense of an already held position. Theology is really apologetics, explaining why a belief is true rather than seeking out truth in and of itself. All theological reasoning is circular, inevitably proving the truth of its own presuppositions. I want to just for reference, my affidavits, I have a degree in biblical studies from Trinity Bible College. I also have a master's degree from Asbury Theological Seminary in theological studies. And so this one kind of hits home a little bit closer to me, but what he's basically saying is very, very true. Okay, having been deep into theology and becoming a theologian myself, and then starting to try to put together good theological explanations for God, I began to realize that there's part of this whole thing, this whole statement that he makes is absolutely true. And I have to get to the reason why they don't want you to know this first. The reason they don't want you to know the truth about theology is because I see it all the time with a lot of YouTubers where they like, well, if you just understood theology a little bit, you would know this. I'm like, no, you wouldn't, because theology just goes around in a circle, okay? It assumes its presuppositions. It assumes certain things about God and doesn't give them up, okay? So it's not really a good search for truth in that respect. And the reason the church doesn't want you to know this is because what you begin to realize is theologians spend an inordinate amount of time trying to justify or rationalize belief in God, okay, by trying to make God make sense. And I spent a lot of time doing this. The pivotal moment for me when deconversion became really, really possible was when I became a Congregationalist pastor, when I didn't have the district looking over my shoulder all the time. And it got me away from a lot of this stuff, okay, that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to sit there and say that there's definitely some, major rationalization in theology. And one of the things I did, and I'll leave the link again in the description, is I began a blog called All Things Rabyd. And All Things Rabyd was about me as a theologian trying to make God make sense. And it really is my journey to coming to understanding the things that Jim Palmer is talking about here, that it's not a free search for truth. Okay, you are bound and held onto a certain path, and this is particularly true if you're a denominational pastor and you have a statement of faith that you have to uphold to remain a pastor. And this is true for anybody inside. The reason why I don't have a problem with some of the education and religious institutions of education, it's just for a fact that the professors are not going to go down certain aspects because they've signed a statement of faith that says they won't. So even if they come up with an understanding of certain things based on texts and reading and philosophy or whatever, even though they come to certain rational things, there's certain core things that they can't give up. And so it isn't a free search for truth. It's not. I didn't really get to the point where it was a free search for truth until I became the Congregationalist pastor, started that blog, and began to examine theological questions. And I did it publicly because I didn't want anybody to think that I was doing it in the corner. The only thing when you read that blog, you need to understand that whatever I'm wrestling with that day, you can go to the time date stamp, is the theological issue that I'm wrestling with. And I wrestled with it a lot with my preaching because I would write out, post, sermon thoughts on that sermon before I went to the next one the next week. And that's how I know, when I deconverted and all that stuff. But that whole blog was my own personal search, and you can still read it, for making the theology make sense, okay? And so much is true here, okay? theology is just defending an already perceived position. It's not a free search for truth. Theologians that are part of seminaries and Bible colleges and graduate schools, for Christians, sign statements of faith, which means they have already said there are certain things that they will not explore, so it's not free. It's not free search for truth. It never is. And so, if you're out there as a believer, you need to understand that your theologian that you think is so great is already chained to certain presuppositions. He cannot give them up. And that's why, as an atheist, I point out, that's why presuppositionalist apologetics doesn't impress me, because you're basically kind of hiding certain things behind a wall, not allowing them to be examined, whereas I kind of examine everything anymore. See, it comes down to the fact that the theologian most often already believes in God, and they are running with certain assumptions about God. They're trying to rationalize God to themselves and to any believer that would follow their reasoning. They're not really, they're not trying to, necessarily prove God exists so much as they're trying to make sure that God makes sense to the believer. That's what a theologian's task is. This is very much like apologetics, because it's exactly what apologetics does these days. The audience is the same. Believers in trying to rationalize belief is the apologist's stock and trade, okay? They attempt to try to prove God still makes sense to unbelievers, and most of their attempts are repeated failures because all their answers are routinely debunked and been dealt with so many times that people get tired of dealing with them. Because they're just trying to convince believers that already believe to stay, to have rationalized reasons to stay, okay? And to most of us outside the faith, and most people outside the faith, or even of different faiths, these are not convincing, okay? And the reason they're not convincing is because we recognize that they start with those presuppositions. They start with presumptions, okay? The apologist is basically, they're not really trying to convince people outside the faith anymore. I've demonstrated that many, many times on this channel. Just look at a lot of my reactions and you'll see that all they're really doing is trying to justify and rationalize belief to people that already believe. Because if you're trying to convince people with some of these arguments and, making some statements like, evolution is a lie, well, it's like, no, evolution is documented to be the truth. So if you're going to have a God belief, you got to take that into account, and when you just deny stuff, you're not, at that point, you're not trying to convince me, okay? What you're trying to do is rationalize why, okay, well, I don't have to believe in this, and I'm trying to rationalize why, okay? You're not doing anything in theology any more than different than the apologists, except this. You're openly acknowledging as a theologian that your audience is actually the church, okay? You're not trying to be this presumptuous apologetics thing where they say, oh, we're trying to win the lost to Jesus Christ. No, you're not. Your audience is still predominantly Christian, and they're looking for reason to rationalize their faith, okay? And the religious establishment doesn't want you to realize that, because they don't want you to realize that you're just trying to rationalize faith, and they also don't want you to realize that they're starting with certain presuppositions about God, and never really challenge those presuppositions, okay, in the first place. And the reason they want that, and the reason they dwell in that realm, is so the rationalizations make sense. Because the moment you start attacking the presuppositions, the moment you actually start, looking at the God belief itself or the attributes of God, like the whole omni thing, you begin to realize, oh, they're not even actually addressing that question. They're just kind of trying to rationalize why that is so. So it isn't about seeking what is true. They assume what's true out the gate. As a theologian, I realize, okay, I have limits because I'm assuming God exists. And for a large part of my theology, I, of course, assumed that the omnis were correct. And then later on, as an open theist, I began to challenge those omnis, not on the grounds that, God doesn't have power or knowledge or whatever, but what does the Bible describe as God's power? What does it describe as God's knowledge? What does it mean to say God is omnipresent in the biblical sense? I became a biblical theologian, which is like the only guide to my theology, theoretically, is supposed to be the Bible, okay, and the Bible alone. And the problem with that, of course, is when you do that is you run into this God of the Bible that's very contradictory. Okay, and I used to say no, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New is the same. But the more you study those two, Yahweh does not line up with the Father that Jesus describes. Okay, he doesn't. He doesn't have the attributes that Jesus describes or Paul describes. When you compare him to Yahweh of the Old Testament, Yahweh of the Old Testament is very different God. And you either, as an open theist, had to say, well, God changed and developed and learned and grew himself, which, to a lot of people, the whole immutability is an issue. But, as an open theist, I would point out, there's a lot of things that say that God changes in the Bible. Okay, so either those statements about him changing his mind or whatever don't make any sense, or they have no value to us, because we might as well just take them out of the Bible, because if you're going to rationalize them away, they really don't have any value at all. And so, as an open theist, I would make that call on classical theologians all the time, and they would go, well, okay, you have a point. Or they would just continue to rationalize the omni-God. And, in the end, y'all fail. And the reason why theology fails is the circular reasoning. Okay, you're automatically assuming God exists. Okay, well, that means there's a part of theology that never, I have this problem passage in the Bible, and it undercuts whether such a God would actually exist, or is this simply a human conception of God, just like any other human's conception of God? You never ask that question. Okay, a lot of theologians who buy the classic stuff never get away from God being all-powerful or omniscient in the classic sense. And so you're starting with the assumption of God, and you're starting with the various assumptions about what God is, and you're trying to make it make sense, so you end up going around in a circle. And it's kind of like, I began to realize, I fixed this problem with God's omnipotence, right? But that causes a problem for his omniscience. I fixed the problem with God's omniscience, and now, that kind of undercuts God being not loving, and now I've got to go deal with that issue. And because I dealt with that issue, now I'm back to God's omnipotence and having to try to figure out how to change it. And I spent most of my pastoral career doing that, going from one attribute of God that was already presupposed and trying to make sense with different reasons and so forth. And by the time I got done, moving to congregationalism, where I had no oversight, and was just, held accountable by the congregation of the church, allowed me a lot of theological freedom. And that's when I began to realize a lot of what Jim Palmer says here is very, very true, about theology. It's a circular path. It goes around in circles. It doesn't really get anywhere. The religious establishment wants you to think that theology is this science about God. No, it's not a science. And the reason it's not a science is the object, God himself, is really slippery to even get a hold of, to even look at and define. And we get all these different definitions of God because we just don't have any consensus about, even within Christian camps, Christian theologians don't have any consensus about the attributes of God, or what is the nature of God, or where, who God is anytime. And they develop all these different theologies, how God relates to people. Of course, you delve into anthropology and soteriology, which is the doctrines of man and the doctrines of salvation. And you got differences of opinion because of how God supposedly works. If God works a certain way, like a Calvinist, then salvation is decreed, and there really isn't anything anybody can do about it. Some people are predestined for hell, and some people are predestined for glory. You get to a more Arminian, open theist kind of view, and no, God isn't trying to put events on a timeline. He's trying to have a relationship with people. And, because of that, it's not his foreknowledge doesn't have to be that set. And his power isn't used in different ways. So it's even, in that case, it's even very up in the air who's going to get saved and why. And so the soteriology, the doctrine of salvation, and the anthropology changes depending on what you think you're constantly going around in this circle, okay? It's circular reasoning. You're constantly presupposing certain things as a theologian. I can speak from experience on that one to quite an extent. And so my journey through this theological understanding, what Jim Palmer is saying, I can attest to. And the reason the religious establishment doesn't want you to know this is they built this mythology around theology itself, like somehow it's a science that comes to very hard conclusions about God. And it's not. It's a softer science than the social sciences. Okay? It is really fluid. And you can do a whole bunch of things with it. You can make up all kinds of crap. Okay, and that's why there's so many theologies and so many interpretations, is because the science itself, theology itself, doesn't have a firm foundation. It's you try to grab a hold of it, and it's like trying to grab water. You might get a little wet on your hands, but you're not going to get the whole thing. And that's the constant struggle of theology. It's not, I've heard it from several apologists. Oh, if you just understood a little bit of theology, you would understand this better. I understand theology all too well. And I can sit there and tell you okay, give me your theological understanding that fixes this problem with God. Okay, well, I can tell you there's 12 different theologies that I know of that would contradict what you just said. Oh, they're wrong because they're the wrong faith. I say, do you see what this does? Okay, because as long as you feel like theology is this hard science that you're actually coming to real definite conclusions about God, you'll continue to live in the mythology of whatever denomination you have, so that they have the true theology, and so that makes it your circular reasoning even about theology. They have the true theology, so I'm engaged in this theology, which is right because my church says that the theology is right, and you go around in a circle. The whole thing of theology keeps you going around and spinning in a circle. You're like a hamster, going on the wheel. Okay, you're constantly coming back to the same bullshit all the time. Okay. What does this do? They don't want you to know that because they want you to think that theology is as hard as science, and it's not. It's not even close. Okay, it is not even as good as philosophy. Okay, philosophy can help us, understand when we're poorly reasoning, or not. Theology is even worse because as much as apologetics and many of the arguments for the existence of God are logical fallacies and engage in logical fallacies, theology is worse. Okay, because nobody ever calls a theologian on his presuppositions most of the time. They just, the believer is, he believes in God and he believes God has these certain attributes as a given. And people outside the church don't really deal with theologians because they already think the apologists are nuts. Okay, like myself, most apologetics is piss poor these days. It's absolute garbage. Okay, they're not even trying anymore in many cases. There's a few people that are notable exceptions that are legit think that there's a real answer and they try. But even worse than that is theologians. Theologians don't even have to face the music about their belief in the God in the first place. It's a justified presupposition. And you go round and round about, okay, we all believe in God here. What's the best way to describe God? And you get, for every theologian, there's a different explanation. It's not a hard science. It's softer than, many social sciences that don't have as much data as others. The hard scientists kick theology's butt, in getting things done. There just isn't anything there. Now, from a deconversion standpoint, one of the things that, of course, happened to me once I realized that this is what theology was and what it does, for me, it became pretty obvious that I was engaged in an exercise that had no evidence or proof for it. That there was no good way to rationalize God anymore, that all of them could be answered. And that became pretty much one of the final nails in the coffin, because when I got to, May of 2015 and I had my sermon on sin and I realized the theology of sin was based on pure presupposition. Sin is a presupposition of faith. You can't find this idea of, these things are a transgression of the law of God outside the Bible. If the Bible doesn't tell you that, you would never think that. Okay, and when I began to realize that, okay, so sin's a presupposition, Christ's salvation is a presupposition without evidence, And God himself has problems because the arguments for God are crap. Okay? So I wrestle with that. Okay, can I have a deist God, a creator God that doesn't give a crap? Yeah, I could, but there's still, it's like they're trying to hold on to the last vestiges of religion that makes sense. That's why I'm not a deist, is because I recognize the theology in it. It has a creed. It's just a very short one. And it has theology. It's just really basic stuff, and you never get past it. It's a rationalized religion, in my opinion, without a lot of, special revelation of what God is. It's more of a natural revelation kind of God that deism is, and eventually after a year I discarded that. And that was the end of it. I mean, if you look at the blog All Things Rabyd, it's funny how the moment I stopped engaging in theology, the moment that blog no longer was important to me, it just dropped off. It's a good way to mark my journey, and maybe someday I'll have the time to read through it again and go, yeah. That's when I realized that this was bullshit. And, I went on from there. And what this does when you come to this understanding of theology is suddenly theology is no longer this hard thing that you really trust in, because you suddenly realize that it's people making things up about presupposed things that have been made up. And you're just going around in a circle. And the big deconversion element with theology is you just hop off the hamster wheel and realize that that's what it is. The whole issue of theology and belief and doctrines and statements of faith is really the hamster wheel that a lot of people get on. And they just keep going, and never get anywhere. And it's one of the, in my opinion, it was very easy for me to discard theology because I could see behind the curtain of that pretty quickly and still do. And so that's how I got rid of it. For some other people, they kind of have this notion that theology is this hard science that leads to truth. And so realizing that's not true can be very detrimental and can ease some of the deconversion aspects, because it's like, I don't even have to trust this stuff. And once you realize that theologians are just apologists that only do their apologetics to the church, so at least they're honest about it, and they're not like the other apologists that claim to be trying to win the lost. That's the only basic difference. And once you realize that, okay, well, all these ideas about God that theologians have, I can chuck them, okay, because they don't have any proof other than their presupposed ideas. And so you begin to get rid of it. So from a deconversion aspect, I think once you come to this realization, anything that the church says, anything a theologian says, anything a pastor says from the pulpit, because a lot of pastors are amateur theologians, and because they never get into a deep dive of what theology is, they just assume it. They never get past that. So that's kind of my thoughts on this one. I think theology is the thing that led to my deconversion faster once I realized how circular it is and how much many of us just presupposed God and presupposed the attributes of God, and we're just trying to make it make sense. And the more you try to do it, the more you engage in it, the less it makes sense. And you try different things, and you suddenly realize they all have the basic same problem of presupposition, so I'm just going to discard the whole thing. And it was, once I realized that about theology, Christianity just dropped off me like so many scales, when you're emoting. And then after that, the belief in God, I just spent a whole year analyzing the deist claims and realizing that it's kind of religion, theology light. And we're just trying to hold on to these last vestiges of what people say about God, and it slips through your fingers pretty quickly when you realize that's just as man-made. And the more you study science and the way the world really works and the way the universe really works, suddenly realize you don't really even need that. And even to the deists, I'm like, what good does it do you? Even if this God does exist, he's not interested in you and he doesn't give a shit about you. So what good is it? What does it do for you? And somebody's watching. Well, no, you've postulated that they don't care. Okay, they just started the universe and wound it up and left. They don't care. Okay, they don't care about justice on planet Earth. They don't care about you don't even postulate a heaven or hell to go to. But what's the afterlife with a deist God? And usually at this point, they're going to lean towards some theology or another that's part of the Islamic camp or the Christian camp or some other camp. And it's like, okay, well, you just told me that you're still a closet Christian or whatever because you're maintaining some views on heaven and stuff. So I don't know. It strikes me, and at that point it was just a matter of just, okay, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in any of this. And until somebody proves themselves to me without this soft soap theology and soft soap apologetics, I guess I'm going to stay here. So that's my thoughts on it. I'd be interested in what you have to say in the comments. I love reading the comments. I don't always respond to them because I get so many these days and I just don't have the time to respond to every comment. So, kind of a call out for those of you that are subscribers and members of the channel, peruse the comments from time to time and lend me a hand. That's probably an easy way to volunteer and help me out. But if you want to support the channel and this work and the continued work that I do, there's super thanks, super chat, super stickers. There's also, my PayPal link is always in every description if that's what you want to do. Also, but the best way is becoming a member. Your monthly support every week that's steady and consistent just makes things a whole lot easier for me. So thank you for that. To my members that are our members, just a shout out to my citizens, to my Rabyd citizens, and to my tribunes. You guys are great. Thank you very much for your support over now the many months of membership being active on this channel. Thank you very much for many of you. You have now reached 2-3 months, and including Azzo has reached 8. I don't know, Azzo. I worry about you, and I think you worry about me, but it's okay. It's a good worry. So thank you very much for those. You guys are great. Like sharing the video. I get reports on how many times the videos are shared, and I appreciate shares probably more than anything else because it means you're putting me in front of a group of people may not know about me or haven't subscribed or anything like that. So, make sure you subscribe to the channel. It's a good way to support me. We just passed 4.5K and working our way to that second to last goal for the year, which is 5K. And then we'll see if we can get to that last goal of 10,000 subscribers before the end of the year. But we're getting very, very close to the second to last goal for the year. So, subscribe to the channel. Help us get there. That's a great way to support the channel. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over. So you don't want to waste your time, money, and opportunities on the trappings of religion and faith, but rather give them to yourself, to the people you love and care for, to make this a better world. You'll be happier if you do. Trust me, I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.